Let me introduce you to the panel. First on the far right is Bob Mullan, the director of this film, a long-term associate of RD Laing, and the author of this wonderful book, Mad to be Normal, which I can strongly recommend, even at £25, arguably the definitive work on Laing's life and a lot of his thinking. Roland Littlewood, one of the great figures in psychiatry, a landmark campaigner against stigma, against racism. He's worked all over the world, principally as an anthropologist, but also as a psychiatrist. I can safely say that he's worked with homeless teams in London and in India, and in his spare time hunts zombies in Haiti. Depth of the man's knowledge, among many other things. Farnaz Arshid, well, most mental illness is not dealt with by psychiatrists, but by prison doctors and GPs. Farnaz has been head prison doctor at Liverpool. She's one of Lancashire's most respected GPs. In her spare time, she looked after refugees and child soldiers in Sierra Leone. And when the military escort didn't turn up to accompany her to the killing fields, she damn well went anyway. Marjorie Wallace almost needs no introduction. Founder of Schizophrenia, a national emergency. Campaigning journalist, drew attention to the horrors of thalidomide back in around 1970 and wrote a series of articles in the Times and the Sunday Times in 1985 to 86, arguing that although the asylums had closed, the trouble, the pain, the need for care of people diagnosed with schizophrenia hadn't. And she's been chief executive of SANE, Schizophrenia, a national emergency, for over 30 years. And last, and definitely with the most interesting eyewear on the panel, as well as some of the most interesting experiences and perspectives, we have Rachel Waddingham, who 15 years ago would have been labelled, indeed was labelled, I believe, a patient with chronic schizophrenia, as well as about, was it 10 other diagnoses, Rachel?
Well, over the time, you know.
Over time, yes. And would have been expected to live out her life gracefully on a high dose of tranquilizers, and not having that much entertainment or satisfaction. Mm-hmm. She is now working for the NHS, has a husband and a baby, is, as you will discover, a marvellously articulate woman, a terrific writer. Her paper in the journal Psychosis on toxicity is the single best article on stigma I have ever read. And she still hears 13 voices, is it, Rachel? 13. Yeah. 13. But she deals with them by a process of dialogue and reflection. So, our wonderful panel, if you wouldn't mind giving them a round of applause, just to cheer them up. And I think especially for Bob for making such a wonderful film, a truly life-affirming piece of work. So, any questions? You can direct them to anyone you like or to the panel in general.
I loved your film, it's fantastic, really fantastic, it's awesome. There's a documentary on television about, not Prozac, but similar to Prozac, and it was about how teenagers were given so many millions of antidepressants, and you know, I can't really judge anybody, the children or the doctors, for whatever's going on, but they were talking about the chap who was doing it, was talking about the brain. I was thinking about this lady in the GP, and their brains are forming, so all the connections are forming still because they're still a child, and it was causing a lot of suicides in some cases, and it really worried me because I've got two teenagers myself. So I don't know what you think of that. I don't know if that's, is medication good in terms of treating mental illness, or has it? I suppose it has its place, and that's what I was thinking about as a question.
Yes, I'm sorry, I really am terribly hard of hearing. Your question was about antidepressants and
for teenagers.
For teenagers,
yeah.
And whether they're suitable. How many medical students do we have in the audience? A grand total of 3. And have you come across the concept of the number needed to treat?
Yes.
Okay, we might come back to that later. Well, let's talk to our psychiatrist. What would you say, Roland, to that lady's question?
What are the problems they're being given the antidepressants for?
Oh, right. I think these children were diagnosed with, well, they had suicidal and self-harming issues, and so they were kind of diagnosing them with antidepressants. But in fact, that was making some of them worse and making them want to commit suicide more. And I don't know enough medically about it, but it worried me really to think that, what is that medication doing? Is it really working or not? I think it has its place. And it's amazing how, just from the film, we've been watching how strong the brain is and how complicated it is, and how every brain is so different. It controls so many things.
And in these cases, no option for psychotherapy?
Yes, I think they were having psychotherapy as well.
As well as the medicine?
Yes, they were. Yeah. But it concerned me that perhaps for teenagers who are taking so much medication now, that maybe we've got to be a bit more wise in not giving children so much medication. And I don't know what you think, but
I quite agree, it is a bit worrying, certainly in very young people. Although as I said, I'm a psychiatrist, I haven't practiced for 5 years, so I'm a bit. So what's your opinion, Athar?
Well, I should have introduced myself. My name is Athar Yawar.
He's a psychiatrist.
I used to be a psychiatrist. I haven't practiced for 7 years, but I was a senior editor of The Lancet, and I dealt with quite a lot of psychiatry. Well, I raised the question of the number needed to treat because it's quite an interesting concept. I think everybody who takes drugs, medication, which I think is most of us, should know about. The concept is that you give 100 people a treatment, and how many of them would do better than they do on placebo. So you can do an antidepressant trial, and you can report, hooray, 54% of people got better. But then in the control arm, 49% of people got better. So the difference is 5%. So you divide 100 by 5% to give you a number needed to treat of 20. In other words, if you were to treat 20 people, one of them would do better on the drug than they do on placebo. And to people I know who are interested in taking medication, who are trying to weigh up risks and benefits, I always recommend they try to find out the number needed to treat for their particular condition and drug. And there's a very good website called the NNT.com, which is run by physicians from Chicago, that actually aggregates information from trials and gives you estimates of numbers needed to treat. Now, I say estimates because, of course, these trials are run by drug companies who like to show that their drugs work, and by academics who may be disappointed if they can't find that the drugs work for a variety of professional reasons. And there are many, many gaps in our data. There was a wonderful paper in Schizophrenia Bulletin 7 years ago pointing out that many basic studies of antipsychotic drugs have simply not been done in terms of long-term studies with proper placebo controls and in terms of studies, good quality studies of people with first episode psychosis. Similarly, with antidepressants, we tend to shy away from well-designed long-term studies. And there was a wonderful paper in The Lancet about 7 years ago, a bit more than that, pointing out how the people who do the trials, roughly 90+% of the time, manage to show that their drug is the best. But that means that when you aggregate the trials, every drug is beating every other drug in a kind of beautiful circle of defeat. And so what I really would love patients to do, and even doctors and medical students to be really well trained to do, is to look at trials critically to make an informed decision in collaboration with their doctor, who of course has expertise and experience. I know that's not a direct answer, but I hope it helps.
Could I add something to that?
Yes, of course, Rachel,
Cool.
you can.
I think almost we might be asking the wrong question if we're thinking, do they work? Because obviously we know for some people they do work, for other people we don't.
Yes.
But when I've worked with children and young people, so I set up a project called Voice Collective in London, working with young people that hear voices, it's more like, what else could we be doing with them, either with or without the medication? How is it that a young person became so overwhelmed and wanted to self-harm? What's the story? And medication doesn't get someone's story. And while people might have been getting some form of therapy, on the NHS it's likely to be short-term CBT, which can be useful but still doesn't really get to understanding. So I'm thinking we use medication in the NHS to prop up a system that doesn't offer enough space to connect with young people, to talk, to understand. And that's really sad.
For GPs, because they must see so many people coming through their door, and for them it's very, very hard. And they see somebody who's very unhappy, and they haven't got that quality time for that person. They've got to try and make a quick decision in the minutes that they've got, and sometimes that comes down to antidepressants. And they haven't got time to sit there and analyse that person and do research on them to make sure that that drug will definitely fit the purpose for them. So yes, I can see what you're saying.
And even I'm a specialist, so I'm currently a patient of the crisis team, which is a team that supports people who would otherwise be in hospital. That's just because I've had a baby recently, so I've got loads of stuff going on. But they're not skilled enough to talk to me about my unusual ideas and my beliefs and stuff. So they've spent 3 or 4 days not knowing where to go, and now we've got the prescription pad because they don't have the support or the time or the skills. And it's weird that who should be the most skilled, the team that's got the most practice in crisis, still doesn't know what to do in terms of connecting with people. So yeah, it's not just GPs, it's the whole system, I think.
It is the whole system, because GP is probably the first point of contact, or the schools. I mean, talking about teenagers, GPs rarely start antidepressants in teenagers. They will refer to the psychiatrist. And often they are really closely monitored. But like you mentioned, what they need is somebody to spend time with them and to listen to what their needs are and to monitor them. And the capacity just isn't there. And the services are so disconnected because the GP will just see them for a short period of time, just like the psychiatrist will see them for a short period of time. But the school, the parents, the health visitors, the school nurses, the mental health team, all those services are no longer communicating with each other efficiently to provide the best possible care for that child or adolescent.
What about care in the community?
Care in the community? Well, I don't think you've got enough time, really. Care in the community, obviously everybody who encounters somebody in need is going to try and do their best, but the resources just aren't there. I mean, to access the crisis team, you have to probably take 40 minutes out of your surgery to contact them, speak to 3 different people and leave your details and send a fax. And maybe the patient might get a call back within the next 12 hours. The crisis team no longer visit patients at home, which is a great disadvantage. GPs are expected to see them in the home environment, but the people who are best trained to deal with their needs won't go there. And then you direct them to urgent care or A&E. Really, that's not the appropriate place for these people to go to or be helped in. So it's a resource issue, it's staffing issues, it's very complex, and I just think at the moment it needs a really good look at and changes to be made, for progress to be made for these people.
Yeah, I'd just like to sort of say that what I'm saying actually isn't schizophrenia a national emergency anymore.
Oh,
it's
sorry.
actually not it started like that when I set it up, but now it's, we run a helpline, and it's the biggest national helpline that actually has people who give psychological support every single evening of the year, and it's now covering absolutely anybody who's troubled, whether it's family members or people. But what we're getting, it's really sad, because when I set up SANE 30 years ago, I called it the forgotten illness, mental illness, the forgotten illness, and since then the awareness has been rising and rising. You know, we've now got the Royals on side, we've got so much going in the way of the awareness, but the calls we get every night at our helpline, you really wouldn't think that anything had improved. We've lost the psychiatric beds. I think there are only 16,000 adult psychiatric beds now in this country. And it's not a question of keeping people in the older sons, having anywhere to go that's safe. And of the children, adolescents, we get so many stories from heartbroken parents saying that their child has had to go 100 miles to get treatment in the only available unit, because we've closed so many units. So we've got this whole dissonance really between the awareness that everyone has been raising and the fact that when people go for help, they can't get the help, or they're shunted across the country to get it. And that's why people are coming to our helpline saying, no, we're desperate, we can't get any help at all now.
Okay, I just wanted everyone actually their personal experiences of RD Laing and the context that this came up in, and also perhaps what the legacy, you feel his legacy has actually been. I mean, it was very, very good film. I found it quite disturbing. I'm a psychiatrist, so I actually found it pretty disturbing on many levels. But I'd be curious to know how people kind of actually, remember the time when this was all happening, really. I don't know whether you would start.
I mean, I only met Ronnie Laing in the last year of his life, 1991, and that's my only knowledge of him. I became interested in him because my mother suffered depression. She had ECT and she never really was the same person ever again. I mean, she certainly was no longer depressed, but she also had no personality. She used to sit in the room looking out, waiting for people to walk past the house. So her personality seemed to have disappeared. So when I was a psychology student, I was just interested in his work, and then I met him the last year of his life. And as for legacy, I think the legacy, if I'm honest, in psychiatry probably is zero, really. I mean, I'm not as experienced as everyone else. I mean, I just make films, and I'm a failed psychologist. And but my experience of psychiatry is not particularly a happy one. I mean, all the psychiatrists I've encountered seem to see the symptoms and not the patient. And it's, it's very interesting for me that it's a great paradox. I mean, like, you'd think that psychiatry is the division of medicine where the doctor would have the best interpersonal skills you'd expect. You'd really want the psychiatrist, when you bring these terrible stories to them, to be able to listen and to respond and to give you some kind of comfort. I personally have had more comfort from an orthopaedic knee surgeon than the average psychiatrist I've met. They seem to have not done the module about interpersonal relations. And it just seems to me that I met a psychiatrist quite recently, and it was the same cold, distant objectification of the patient. And I think Laing's legacy is zero, in the sense of what he taught was intimacy with people, looking at the person, not the symptoms, etc., etc. So I don't think I think, as Marjorie was saying, when she was saying that things don't seem to have got better in 30 years, I mean, I don't think psychiatrists have really joined the programme.
Marjorie?
Well, I'm very, very... I have to say that the whole experience of RD Laing has been a big shadow over my life, because when I was a student, a psychology student, I met this doctor who was very, very consumed with Laing's ideas. And in those days, in the 60s, they could do experiments. And I was paid £3 a day, which is amazing. It was the only way I ate. And he would be giving me Largactil and LSD to look at the effect on my breathing and sense of humour with punch cartoons. I went on to marry this wonderful psychiatrist some years later. So, reader, I married him. But as I grew to learn more about the way that Laing operated, we then, on top of marrying the psychiatrist, psychoanalyst he became, he then took one of Laing's old clinics into our house, into the basement of our house. So we had sort of Langian practice taking place in the basement. I'm trying to have children upstairs, very much like Angie in film, and we've got all this going on downstairs. And then I must say I did get increasingly worried about it, but I just finalised by saying that all that was counterculture, was 60s, yes, I accept all that. I do accept that Laing did do something which I've always thought was right, was he said not the breaking down, but the breaking through is listening to people, actually making sense of their delusions, and just not just dismissing them because they are depressed. But I'm coming to the big but. I think he hasn't had a zero legacy. I think it's been an appalling legacy, because I have come across so many families completely destroyed by people who had their old legacy of Langian ideas, that it was parents who caused mental illness, that it was mothers whose upbringing, giving them conflicting messages, made a person schizophrenic, a schizophrenic mother. And I have met some of those mothers, heartbroken people, and I've also known suicides taking place, all through this legacy of the fact that the parents were to blame. And I do think that's a very, very worrying legacy.
I think I agree. I think actually it's quite a feminist point to take as well from that, because, you know, blaming the mothers, you know, schizophrenic mothers was a phrase that's just frightening. You know, think about it, you know, blame women.
But he never said that. I mean, you know, it's really important to know that. I mean, lots of people who were, you know, it's like, you know, people who wanted to follow RD Laing might have said that, but he never said that.
But it sounds like he did.
But it was portrayed in the divided self. Anyone who saw the divided self, of course, the mother was painted out to be the villainous person. And I had the first case that made me sit up sane was really as a girl. She was at the Arbours, which is one of Lang's legacies. So Joe Burke wasn't in the film, and I'm sure you met him. She was sent there. She was not allowed any contact with her parents, her mother, and they, in the end, I was on the search for her because she'd gone missing, because it was her choice to go missing. I found her. She was 7 months pregnant. She'd chosen not to have antenatal care, and the Arbours had allowed all this to happen, not told the parents, and the girl did have the baby, and the baby has been damaged. And I came across quite a lot of those cases. So it wasn't that he said schizophrenic, it was the way that it was interpreted and then how it played out into the way that people were treated.
I mean, if you're interested, I mean, what I think RD Laing said was, firstly, there were three aspects of his work. Firstly, if you can't understand something a so-called schizophrenic person is saying, it could be your problem, not theirs. You have to wear your detective's hat, spend a bit more time and try and find out what's going on, instead of just thinking, hearing voices, here we go, we know the prescription, bish bosh, which is what normally happens. Second point I think he was trying to say is that within certain families, certain patterns go on, that, you know, whereby some people get scapegoated, some people are picked upon, and so on and so forth. So he simply said you look at the wider context of someone's problem. So if they come and knock on your door, you don't just treat them, you look at their family as well. And the third thing he said, and this is this stuff that I didn't agree with at all, was when he was very countercultural, and he said, is it mad to be normal or normal to be mad? And his argument was, you know, in a world run by crazy people, like at the moment, how dare they say some people are mad when they're the so-called normal people? But I think, and as I've tried to portray in the film in the first dinner table, as he says, I never say that all mothers cause schizophrenia. He never ever said that.
Roland.
Thank you. I talk a little bit about the film. To a certain extent, you use Lang's own phrase to interpret what he's going through in the film. I just wonder if we could go back a bit and maybe look at where those ideas come from. He partly picked them up from Winnicott, but it's this American tradition of schizophrenic mothers, skewed family relationships, and so on. Just by chance, last week I saw with my daughter the film The Rebel Without a Cause, which portrays the family of the protagonist, James Dean, has been the father's weak and has no power in the household. There is successful outside. The mothers are extremely conservative, reactionary, and invalidating them. And that seems a common theme in 1950s America. It seems that and a lot of American psychiatrists and psychologists would have bought into that. So where does that post-war image come from, which presumably Laing also experienced himself? The weak, obsessional mother.
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
What's it mean culturally? Why in the 1950s does this happen? And all the psychiatrists say, yes, this is the origins of schizophrenia. And from what you said, Laing seems to have experienced something very similar himself in his own family, and then uses that as a general theory.
But I mean, I just don't think he did. I mean, you know, so I think we should widen it out. I mean, my reading of RD Laing is obviously different from everybody else's, you know. I mean, I think the role of the mother is very minimal, I think, in his work. I mean, there are much more important aspects, and the most important is when you see a patient, you don't just see the patient, you see the people around them. Now, that might be the mother, it might be the father, it might be an uncle, it might be a child, it might be social class, it might be the colour of the skin. But, you know, I mean, the biggest impact he had, funnily enough, was on social work. I mean, social workers, you know, lapped up his work because, you know, the title gives the game away, social work. I mean, you know, they loved Laing's work because he said, you know, the client or the patient isn't just the person standing in front of you, it's other people too. So that's a positive legacy. But I will go back to the fact that the psychiatrists I meet don't look at life like that at all.
Rachel, have you been RD Laing lately? Oh, sorry, Bob, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Sorry.
Have I been RD Laing's? I've not taken loads of LSD and danced around and no. It's interesting. So I've got so many thoughts bubbling around because there's quite a lot of hot topics that have been hit on already. The one I'll say is the most useful legacy I think of RD Laing is that it's inspired lots of people to journey with those of us who are deemed mad. So I think, like you said, Marjorie, about the sense. There's always sense. No so-called madness is without context. It's just that we don't listen right, and I love that. I think the unfortunate legacy for me in my work is the idea of anti-psychiatry. So I think because the bit about the mum has been very much talked about and hung upon, and I don't know the accuracy of that because I've just not read enough, but it's there in our culture. And it's as if there's been a big backlash to go, no, it's not the mums, it's not the families, it's the illness. The illness is bad, we must fight the illness. And we've depersonalised it and decontextualised it. So people are running around to beat this schizophrenia or depression as if it doesn't exist in the world with us. Absolutely. And so I've experienced that treatment where people have tried to treat the so-called schizophrenia and missed this context. And so my work is, what I do now in Open Dialogue is all about working with families and networks, not with that blame hat on to go, whose fault is it? But to try and understand the story of the family and the network and not have blame.
I mean, one thing I would say is that in the cartoons, if you ever watch these Hollywood cartoons, whenever someone goes crazy, it's because they've been driven crazy. Now, if it's good enough for Hollywood, I think it should be good enough for psychiatry. This idea of schizophrenia as a neurological disease is based to a large extent on the samples of people who have taken drugs that alter their brain structure. So there's a wonderful study by Seaman, I think back in 1978, when he said, we've solved the problem. Everyone diagnosed with schizophrenia has a high number of D2 receptors. And he put it on a lovely slate graph. Well, except he didn't say we've solved the problem. He said this could be because we're giving them drugs that have blocked the D2 receptors. And 40 years on, you have doyens of psychiatry such as Robin Murray, who is saying, actually, this is not a progressive neurological disease. Now, Robin would still argue that there is some dopamine dysfunction. I think that's debatable. But I personally would largely disagree with that. In drug-free patients, I'd be very doubtful that there is a neurochemical dysfunction that you can pin down. But certainly much of our ideas about it being a progressive disease were based on the effects of psychiatric treatment. Now, when it comes down to RD Laing's legacy, at the risk of being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, I think this is important. I think we need to talk about capitalism, and I think we need to talk about neoliberalism, because doctors work within a structure of what they are given the money to do. And even science works within a structure of what scientists are given the money to do. You have some scientists with enormous integrity, and I know that we have at least one towards the back of the hall. But most scientists, sadly, depend on the stories they are being told, and quite often the stories they are being paid to investigate.
But Laing wasn't anti-capitalist.
No, he wasn't. I mean, he wasn't anti-Marxist.
Put him into that Marxist category. He was never particularly left-wing.
True. True. No, what I'm really talking about is if we're looking at Lang's legacy, we have to look at the social context and the economic context of doctors, as well as the social and economic context of the patient. Farnaz, how is capitalism in East Lancashire?
I think you summarised it really well, in the sense that at the moment your hands are tied with the fact that you don't. We're talking about Lang and the points that you've mentioned. Unless you invest time in listening to the patient and understanding what's brought them to you at that point in the first place, there's no way you're going to find any resolution or any pathway to help them. Unfortunately, the way the system is at the moment, where you have 8 minutes on average with a patient, you're just not going to achieve that. And the funding, the time, the clinicians they aren't available to provide the care that these people truly need. So you're just sticking plasters on till the next crisis and hoping somehow that you get away with it. So yeah, money and time is making a really huge negative impact on these people and their needs.
We've got time for 2 more questions, though we may have to go a little bit faster. Yes, Isabella.
I just wanted to ask a word just about, so you talk about the neurobiological sort of cause or whatever of schizophrenia. What do you think of the sort of like the genetic research, that sort of the idea that schizophrenia has been in the population for potentially thousands of years at exactly the same rate? It always catches me out. I wondered if any of you have got
no evidence of that. No evidence schizophrenia existed before Christianity.
Right.
If you look at the Hippocratic corpus, it's not analysed schizophrenia. Mania, yes. Dementia, yes. Delirium, yes. But not analysed schizophrenia. First appears with Solanus and then Galen in the 2nd and 3rd century.
But you know what I'm referencing, like the meaning of madness and that work. So you don't give that credence.
I blame the psychological internalisation which has gone along with Christianity.
Can I invoke the spirits of the late, great Jane Mellanby? She's not late, I apologise. Jane Mellanby, whom you know. One of the great doyens of psychology here in Oxford, a woman of magnificent clarity of mind. And the first lecture of hers I went to, there were a whole row of us undergraduates, and she said, "What is a gene?" 20-year-olds, lecture theatre, dead silence. "What is a gene?" Dead silence. "A gene is a strand of DNA that makes a protein." "What do genes make?" "Proteins." "What do genes make?" "Proteins." Now, nearly all gene association studies are shown subsequently to be false positives. I think the answer is roughly 97%. There's a wonderful paper by John Yanidis about this. Because what they do is they sift lots of genes, they get an exciting association, they publish. The more bizarre the association, the more interesting it is. So unlikely associations are actually more likely to go in the high-impact factor journals. And then very, very quietly, meticulous research showed that it was a false positive. So we talk a lot of gene myth in psychiatry. But if ever anybody talks to you about a gene, say, "Which protein is that then, babes?" You don't have to say babes. But ask what the protein is, and then you may get a logical answer.
So you don't think there's a genetic basis for schizophrenia?
Well, if we're talking about genes, we're talking about proteins that might affect the way you think and feel and relate to people. Bear in mind also that schizophrenia is not a unitary definition. It's come together as a diagnosis, as a historical accident, based on work going back to the post-Christian work in 1860s France, 1880s Germany, where they were trying to construct a psychiatry that didn't involve the journey of the soul. So you have to ask, what you're asking really is which proteins could allow for unusual or possibly understandable feelings in certain contexts dictated by historical accidents in 19th century psychiatry, which is not an answerable question. Farnaz, any thoughts?
No, I'm with you on that one.
just can I just say, because I'm a horrible doctor, I'm a very medical, biological psychiatrist, I probably am, But what do you think about this idea of this sort of encephalitis, this first episode of psychosis? They're now finding autoantibodies, they're doing immunological treatment, and they're finding people get totally cured. It's not everybody, it's only for a very small proportion, but how does that tally with it being a totally non-biological illness?
Could I come in on this? It's just one of the interesting things is we talk about schizophrenia, I think, as you were saying, as if we know what it is, this thing called schizophrenia. Most people, as you'd know, would say that it's many, many different things, and there may well be some physical bits in there. But the problem is we're talking about it like it's one thing. I mean, you talk about causation, trauma, racism, social inequality, that has a big thing. Bullying has been linked with psychosis. Got drugs, we've got so many different things, and we talk about it as if it's just simple. I'd be really curious about the amount of money that's been spent on genetic research, for example. Why are they looking to see if my genes are different? Do you want to change my genes so that I won't have a schizophrenic child? Isn't that like eugenics or something? It feels really icky. What's the use in having genes? Is it for better treatments? What if I don't want treated because I don't think I'm ill? The particular kind of thing I have is a journey. It's difficult. It's almost killed me because the support wasn't there, but it's my life. Why do people want to know about my genes and my brain structure? I think ask the deep questions under that. Why is it deemed worthy of money? But the support that I want, the therapeutic communities, the crisis houses don't get funded. So political.
Marjorie.
Well, I mean, I'm not a scientist, so I don't pretend to answer these questions. But we have a research centre in Oxford, and we are very interested in the origins of psychosis. I do think that just by through looking at families, and it does definitely run in certain families, that there is something to learn from that. I think that the most wonderful day will happen when we get medications which are much more targeted to the chemical profile. And we've got some Americans at the moment in our building who are just looking at that, so that you don't waste years and years giving people medication that's just making them iller and iller, because they're never going to respond to that medication. But those that do, you can pick out and help. So I think the dream is to be able to get more tailored medication to the particular chemical profile of individuals, and that's what we are really hoping for.
I don't think genetics is frightening for those who favour environmental explanations. What seems to me quite likely, probably 10% of populations around the world have a propensity to a psychosis, which in the modern world, with social disadvantage, is manifested as schizophrenia. And we know that something like 1 in 10 people born in the West Indies who migrate to Britain will develop schizophrenia. And the figure is horrifyingly large. And even for their children born in Britain, very high rates.
Last question, I'm afraid we've got 1 minute each to answer. Last question.
I think the main thing I took from the film and his approach to care was actually the role of compassion and almost love that he showed towards his patients. And part of the problem, obviously, with his marriage was it was almost exclusively towards his patients. And I'm quite interested to ask about whether you think there needs to be more of a stress on the role of love and compassion that a doctor should show towards the patient in this kind of context, to the extent that it might need to be explicitly told and taught to a medical student like myself, because some people just might miss out on that as an idea.
Yes, but not taking off your trousers.
But it's interesting because it's like, how far do you go as a doctor if you think it would make your patient more comfortable? And I guess my question is at what point do you prioritise that? Prioritising love and compassion and making your patient comfortable versus making sure care is automated and structured correctly and health and safety is followed and everything like that. I don't actually know, as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, are you allowed to hug your patient or kiss them on the forehead, for example? An action that he took repeatedly during the film, and I would suggest for an adolescent individual, for example, something that could be really, really comforting. So at what point do you prioritise one or the other? Are you sacrificing actually quality, comfort and care, just adhering to regulations?
Well, I kiss my patients. Did you have that?
Not more than once. Not at all. Sorry, that was a glib
Not
one-liner.
at all.
I didn't kiss my patients, no.
You never kissed your patient?
Never kissed my patients. You see
So
what
there
they're
are
missing out on?
differences between us.
I've hugged and kissed my patients, but they're elderly patients, and it's usually the women that come and want to give you a hug after you give them an awful diagnosis, and I just feel churlish not to, actually. They sort of say, oh, it must be really hard for you. You're thinking, God, I just told you this awful thing, and they're saying it must be really hard for you. It's some people, it's really interesting, actually.
Marjorie, love and compassion?
Well, obviously, I mean, love and compassion is very, very important, and I think that's where a charity like ours can give more love and compassion. I mean, but we still have to operate very strongly with that terrible word, boundaries, And all our volunteers, we have sort of 80, 90, they all have to be taught boundaries about not getting too immersed in the life stories of people, because then they can't help them in the end. And I think that's what came through on the Laing film. His immersion into all their dark material meant a terrible price on his family. It didn't show in your film, it didn't show half the damage he did to his family. I mean, if you've read any of his son's biography, if you've read any of what the children said about living with Laing as a father, and the way that he didn't look after his children and his family, I think you've got to draw a balance there. You've got to be able to not get so immersed in the life journey of people who are suffering that you can't then save them, that you can both drown in that, and therefore boundaries are necessary.
I'll just sort of follow up back to that. Aldous Huxley wrote this book called The Doors of Perception in the 1950s about him taking mescaline, and one of the most interesting things that stuck with me when I read it was that he said you could never understand the mind of a madman. I can't remember exactly how he put it, but essentially someone who's going through psychosis, you can never understand them until you yourself have been through that. So I'm interested to know, at what point therefore, along the spectrum of psychosis versus doctor, someone totally normal, at what point would you put the psychiatrist along that spectrum so that they can actually understand their patients and help them? You could argue that RD Laing went too far over to one side perhaps and therefore got too immersed. But surely you need to be somewhere along that spectrum to actually understand what the patient is doing.
That's a very interesting question.
I don't want to be, this endless defender of RD Laing because I'm just a filmmaker. However, Marjorie, what she says about the children, I think have to put into context. He had 10 children with at least 4, maybe 5 women. There are 2 vocal children, and they're the ones that people know about, and they form their opinion because of 2 children who speak up. There are many of the other children who have very, very different views about their father, and all they remember is great love and comfort from their father. So the idea that he damaged all these families is not strictly true. It's an opinion. It's one opinion formed through 2 of the children, 2 out of 10. For example, the daughter Natasha will give you a completely different view of her father. I just wanted to say that.
Rachel, how would you like your psychiatrist to be?
Well, the funniest thing is I'm a practitioner as well, so it's
Very true. Very true.
I guess where I'd sit on that, not as a psychiatrist but as a therapist, is I've no idea. It's a circle. I think the idea of seeing it as a line, the mad, the sane, the doctor, the patient, is false, because we all experience despair, we all experienced loss, terror. It's just that some of us maybe are more intensely overwhelmed by that. Within open dialogue, there's a big thing about just being with people and listening to what's going on inside yourself as you're connecting with someone, and actually speaking from the personal to say what's being moved in you. That has been really hard for some of my psychiatrist colleagues that are learning it, because they've been taught to kind of have the boundary distance. But it's been quite profound. I think reflective practice, so this practice where you're thinking, well, why am I doing that? With Laing, why was he taking his trousers off? I saw that and I was like, she might have gone through trauma. She looked very frightened at times, and I was like, you don't do that. Don't kiss her head. I was like slapping him. In that case, you'd be thinking, how do I connect with this young woman? Sitting on the ground, taking shoes off seems really brilliant. But you'd be thinking, why is it that I feel I need to now do what she's doing? And you'd have to think and wonder what your motivations are. That's what keeps you from getting lost, that continual reflection. And I think if we lose that, we replace it with rules, which we do in the mental health system of fixed boundaries. To have the messy grey boundaries, we need to be really, really on it. Otherwise, we get lost.
Farnaz?
Coming back to your original point about how do we incorporate that into our learning as medical students, I think it all stems from a really simple idea. You've got to listen. You've got to go in there with an open mind, be compassionate, and sit there and listen, and you'll be guided. And as a clinician, you'll know your boundaries, and you'll know, most people I've worked with will know what's appropriate for one person may not be appropriate for another person. So you've got to be guided by that individual, and it's got to be personalised care, whether it's in the form of a drug treatment or whether it's the way you consult, or how you consult, or the amount of time you allocate for a consultation. So it's individualising your care and the way in which you treat a patient, which has to be instilled into people as they train, I think.
I mean, in answer to your question, in the middle, yeah. I mean, one thing that strikes me as a total outsider, but someone who used to visit my mum. When I visited my mum in a psychiatric hospital, it was interesting. Where I lived in the Midlands, all the buses had 3 digits, like 658, 123, 429, except there was one bus called the X58, and that was the one that went to the loony bin, right? And everyone knew that when that bus came to the bus stop, everyone stepped back, unless they had the misfortune of having to go and visit somebody, right? Now, they were terrible days. But it just strikes me, listening to everything that everybody says, and my own experience with psychiatrists and friends' experience with psychiatrists and the mental health system, that I just wonder, I mean, the important question is that, have things really got any better? And I just can't help but think the answer is no. And I think that all the money being pumped in to find some kind of biological explanation is missing the point. Surely, everything is interactionist. You can have a predisposition to some kind of disorder, but you have to have a life that will either make that vulnerability happen or not. I mean, to me, Athar was quoting books. There's one book that really influenced me by George Brown and Tyrrell Harris called The Social Origins of Depression, a very simple book saying that some people have a predisposition to depression. However, there have to be social triggers, like being a one-parent mother, one-parent family, a terrible housing condition, to make that predisposition come alive. Surely that's common sense, and the idea to pump all this money for this silver bullet is ludicrous.
I think if we're talking about your question, what should medical students do? I think we need to know what medicine is for. Now, in Christian Islamic societies in medieval times, the real doctor was the one who could help you purify your soul, and the physician was someone who might sort out your body. But given that your body wasn't eternal and your soul was, Chaucer makes fun of the distinction and sort of creates a physician who is a caricature of a physician, showing the limits of a purely materialistic outlook, as Chaucer saw it. So, if love and compassion are what our lives are for, or if truth is what our lives are for, then the question is, how does the doctor fit into that? I think the first question has to be by being, as much as we can, people of integrity and honesty and compassion and love in our own lives, which involves a tremendous degree of transparency to ourselves. And in my limited experience, patients pick that up. I look back and I remember when I was being straight with patients and how healing that was. And I remember when I was hiding behind theory or a persona and how destructive that was. And so I think if we ourselves are straight with ourselves, including in examining the whole body of science as it comes to us, as we need it, then medicine takes care of itself. Any final comments?
Maybe.
I just think that guy wants to come back and say anything else. No?
Yeah, hey, I think it's interesting. It's interesting. I think your point was a really good one about coming full circle and things. It's very difficult, I think, to know where to draw the line as an individual and whether or not you'd get reprimanded or told off from a superior because they see things slightly differently to the way you see it. And I think almost being your own individual as a psychiatrist in terms of how you treat patients there should be more scope for that.
And you absolutely would get told off. Like, I did an eating disorder placement, actually my overall experience of it was incredibly positive, and I thought the psychiatrists were really amazing. But there was a young woman, sort of my kind of age, just being dropped off by her parents to be admitted into the inpatient ward. And she was crying, obviously, and she sat on the bed and she said, "Will you sit with me?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course." And without even thinking, I put my hand on her shoulder, and the nurse came in and ran in and took me out. I was like, you can't touch her. Like, absolutely, you can't form a connection like that. And it was like I made a massive faux pas. And I was really shocked, and I was like,
which would be understandable if all the treatments, etc., that were given worked. If everything psychiatrists did worked, yes, tell the junior off who's showing some love and compassion. But being as most of psychiatry fails, that's the issue, isn't it?
Well, on that cheerful note, I'm afraid we must stop. Time to vacate the hall. We have to be out of here actually in 2 minutes.
Run! No.